The world of Kang Min-jun was a cathedral of silence. Not the gentle, peaceful quiet of a library, but the absolute, profound vacuum left by God's held breath. He was the head of the Golden Dragon Syndicate, a position inherited through blood and cemented by a mythology he had not created, but had learned to wield. The legend said he was born deaf, and in that silence, he had cultivated a different kind of sight. He saw the tremor in a man's jaw that betrayed a lie, the subtle shift of weight that preceded an attack, the flicker of greed in an eye across a crowded room. His deafness was not a vulnerability, it was his most formidable weapon, a filter that stripped away the distracting noise of the world and left only the stark, brutal truth of human intention. His mansion, a stark monolith of concrete and glass perched on a hill overlooking Seoul, was an extension of his being. The floors were polished stone, transmitting the faintest vibrations of an approaching footstep. The air was still, unscented, a neutral canvas upon which the sweat of a nervous visitor would paint a vivid portrait of fear. His men, loyal to the point of fanaticism, moved around him with a reverence that bordered on worship, communicating in a precise, economical sign language of their own devising. They did not speak in his presence, for speech was a currency his kingdom did not trade in. He was a myth, a ghost in a tailored suit, his throne a silent one. And from this throne, he saw everything. He read lips with the precision of a cryptographer, and his own silence was a suffocating pressure that broke men more effectively than any torture. He was 32 years old and had never heard a single sound. He did not know the crash of a wave, the melody of a psalm, or the sound of his own name on another's lips. He did not miss what he had never had. There was no room for such sentiment in the cold calculus of his survival. His world was complete, ordered, and brutally effective. Into this silent, ordered world came Adeola. She was an outsider in every conceivable way, a foreigner, a woman, and utterly unimpressed by the aura of terror that clung to the mansion like a shroud. Hired through a discreet agency that catered to the city's elite, she was assigned to the domestic staff, a ghost of a different sort. She was a woman of solid presence, her movements economical and unhurried. She wore the simple dark blue uniform and white apron with a kind of placid dignity. Unlike the other staff, who scurried with their eyes downcast, Adeola moved with a calm deliberation. She did not flinch when Min-jun entered a room. She did not avert her gaze. She would simply pause her work, offer a small, respectful inclination of her head, and then continue polishing the black marble or dusting the priceless ceramics. This lack of fear was, to Min-jun, a profound anomaly. He was an ecosystem, and she was an invasive species that refused to adapt to the climate of fear. He began to watch her. He saw the way her hands, though unadorned, were meticulously clean, her nails short and practical. He saw the way she observed her surroundings, not with the furtive glances of the fearful, but with the focused assessment of a professional evaluating a task. She never tried to speak to him, never offered the ingratiating, useless movement of lips that others did. She simply did her work, her quiet solidity a strange comfort in the glass and steel austerity of his home. She was a constant, a predictable variable in a life filled with them, yet she felt entirely different. One afternoon, while she was cleaning the floor-to-ceiling windows of his study, a bead of sweat traced a path down her temple. She did not wipe it away. She finished her pane of glass, her focus absolute, her breath fogging a small circle that she immediately polished away. Min-jun, seated at his vast obsidian desk, found himself watching her instead of the security feeds. She was a puzzle, a quiet defiance he could not decipher. And for the first time in a long time, Kang Min-jun was curious. The catalyst was not a syndicate war or a back-alley betrayal. It was a headache. It began as a low thrum behind Min-jun's right eye, a familiar pressure that sometimes accompanied long periods of intense focus. But this was different. The pressure escalated with terrifying speed, becoming a sharp, metallic spike driving into his skull. The world, usually so crisp and defined to his eyes, began to swim. The hard edges of his desk blurred. A wave of vertigo so profound washed over him that the room seemed to tilt on its axis. He gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning white, a sheen of cold sweat breaking out on his skin. He felt a vibration on the floor and looked up. Adeola stood in the doorway, a tray with a glass of water in her hands. Her face, usually so placid, was etched with concern. She saw him sway, his hand slipping from the desk. She put the tray down with a silent thud and rushed to his side, her solid frame a bulwark as she eased him into his chair. Her professionalism was a calming force in the chaos of his senses.
She did not panic.
She knelt before him, her eyes scanning his face. He tried to wave her away, a gesture of dismissal, but the pain was a white-hot nova behind his eyes. He slumped back, surrendering to it. Her gaze was intense, analytical. She saw the pallor of his skin, the fine tremor in his hand. And then she saw it, a faint redness, an inflammation deep within the canal of his right ear, almost hidden by the fold of the helix. It was something she had been trained to look for a lifetime ago, in a different world. With a gentleness that was startling, she reached out and tilted his head towards the light from the window. Her touch was firm, clinical. Minjun froze, and used to any physical contact that wasn't violent or formal. She leaned closer, her brow furrowed. From a small pocket in her apron, she produced a pair of slender, medical-grade tweezers, the kind used for delicate electronic or medical work. "Hold still," she murmured, her voice a vibration he felt more than heard. He watched her face, the absolute concentration there. She carefully inserted the tip of the tool into his ear canal. He felt a strange, scraping pressure. A minute shift, then a sharp, pulling sensation. She withdrew the tweezers. Clamped in their fine metal jaws was a small, dark object. It was no longer than a grain of rice, segmented and black, with hair-like filaments that made it look chillingly organic, like some monstrous, chitinous parasite. It wasn't flesh. It wasn't bone. It was foreign. And the moment it left his body, the world exploded. For the first time in his life, Kang Min-jun heard a sound. It was the sound of Adela's sharp, indrawn breath. It was a tidal wave, a hurricane, an avalanche of pure, unfiltered sensation that slammed into his brain with the force of a physical blow. The sound was a violation. It was a cacophony of a million tiny, meaningless noises that had never before existed. The hum of the lights overhead, the distant drone of traffic beyond the reinforced glass, the rustle of Adela's apron, the frantic, terrified thunder of his own heart beating inside his skull. It was all a monstrous, undifferentiated roar. He cried out, a raw, guttural noise he did not recognize as his own, and clapped his hands over his ears, but the gesture was useless. The sound was already inside him, a poison flooding his system. The pain in his head was gone, replaced by this new, overwhelming agony of sensation. He stared at Adeola, his eyes wide with a terror he had never known. She was still kneeling before him, the tweezers held aloft, the tiny, dark object still clamped in their grip. Her lips were moving. He forced himself to focus, to use the old skills, to read the shape of her words through the tsunami of noise. "Are you okay? Can you hear me?" Her voice. He could isolate it now, a thread of melody in the chaos. It was low, calm, a resonant anchor in the storm. He shook his head, not in negation, but in sheer, uncomprehending disbelief. The door to the study burst open. Uncle Park stood there, his face a mask of avuncular concern. Park Jin-woo, his father's most trusted friend, the man who had raised Min-jun after the accident, the regent of his silent kingdom. "Min-yun, what is it?" We heard Park's words died in his throat. His eyes locked onto the object in Adela's tweezers. The mask of warmth and loyalty did not crack. It evaporated. In an instant, the kind, doting uncle was gone, replaced by a predator whose cover had been blown. A cold, reptilian fury filled his eyes. His gaze flickered from the object to Min-jun's face, seeing the unmasked shock and dawning comprehension. The betrayal was so sudden, so absolute, it was its own form of violence. And then Park spoke, his voice no longer the gentle baritone Minjun had only ever seen shaped on his lips. The sound of it, heard for the first time, was thin, sharp, and laced with a contempt so profound it was breathtaking. "You stupid girl," he hissed, his words directed at Adeola, but his eyes burning into Minjun. "What have you done?" The world narrowed to the space between Minjun and his uncle. The cacophony of the room faded, replaced by the ringing in his ears and the sound of Park's voice, each word a physical blow. "He was perfect," Park snarled, taking a step into the room. Two of Minjun's personal guards followed him in, their faces grim, their hands already moving to their weapons. A quiet god. A perfect, silent tool. "And you broke him," Minjun's mind, reeling from the sensory overload, latched onto the one solid thing it could process: threat. The posture of the guards, the venom in Park's voice, the sudden, chilling clarity of a lifetime of manipulation. The dizziness was gone, replaced by a surge of pure adrenaline. He was still the man who could read an attack in the twitch of a muscle. He saw the subtle signal Park gave his men, a flicker of the eyes. Before the guards could even draw their weapons, Minjun moved. He exploded from the chair, not with the grace of a martial artist, but with the raw, desperate fury of a cornered animal. He shoved the heavy obsidian desk with all his strength. It screeched across the polished stone floor, a horrific, grinding noise that made him flinch, and slammed into the legs of the first guard, sending him toppling. In the same motion, Minjun grabbed Adela's arm. "Come," he commanded, his own voice a rough, unfamiliar rasp in his throat. She didn't hesitate. She scrambled to her feet, her hand instinctively closing around the tweezers, protecting the tiny piece of evidence. The second guard lunged. Minjun, disoriented by the noise but operating on pure muscle memory, sidestepped and drove his elbow into the man's throat. The guard choked, the sound a wet, gurgling horror. "Get them," Park roared, his voice echoing in the cavernous study. Minjun didn't look back. He pulled Adeola through a side door concealed behind a bookshelf, plunging them into a narrow service corridor. The flight was a nightmare of sound. Alarms began to blare, a piercing, rhythmic shriek that felt like needles in his brain. Men shouted down hallways, their voices overlapping into a meaningless roar. Every footstep on the metal stairs was a clang that vibrated through his bones. He was running blind in a world that had suddenly become hostile in a new and terrifying way. Adeola was his only guide. When he flinched from the sound of a closing steel door, she tightened her grip on his hand, her presence a steady, grounding force. They burst out of a service exit into the manicured gardens, and for a moment, the sound was different. The shriek of alarms was muffled, replaced by the wind in the trees and the distant hum of the city. But it was no less overwhelming. Minjun stumbled, pressing his palms against his ears. Adeola pulled him behind a large, sculpted hedge. "Breathe," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Just breathe. Focus on me." On my voice, he looked at her, his legendary control shattered, his face pale and slick with sweat. He was no longer a myth. He was a man, terrified and betrayed, on the run in his own kingdom. They found refuge in the city's sprawling, anonymous heart, a place Minjun knew only from maps and surveillance reports. He led them, using a lifetime of strategic knowledge, to a small, nondescript hotel in a district where no one asked questions. The journey was an ordeal. The cacophony of the city, the shriek of subway brakes, the blare of car horns, the overlapping chatter of 1,000 conversations, was a physical assault. Minjun moved through it like a man walking through fire, his jaw clenched, every muscle taut. Adeola became his shield, her body a physical buffer in crowds, her calm voice a lifeline he clung to. In the sterile quiet of the hotel room, the silence was almost as deafening as the noise. It was a hollow, empty thing, pregnant with the sounds he now knew he was missing. He sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, trying to process the enormity of the betrayal. His entire life, his very identity, had been a lie constructed by the one man he had trusted implicitly. He looked at Adeola, who was standing by the window, keeping watch. In her hand, she still held the small, dark object, now wrapped carefully in a tissue. That was the key. The proof. He knew he needed more. He needed the full truth. There was only one person who could have implanted such a device. It would have required a specialist, a doctor of incredible skill and questionable ethics. Park was a monster, but he was not a surgeon. Minjun's mind, trained for strategy, began to work through the fog of shock and sound. He accessed a deep, encrypted network from a burner phone procured on their way, his fingers flying across the keypad with practiced ease. He searched for records, financial transactions, anything that linked Park to the medical underworld 25 years ago, around the time of his parents' death. A name emerged. Dr. Kim Young-soo, a brilliant but disgraced neurotechnologist who had vanished from the public eye after a scandal. Minjun found a last known address, a small, private clinic in a forgotten corner of the city. It was a long shot, but it was the only thread he had. He showed the address to Adeola. "We go here," he said, his voice still a rough approximation of speech. She looked from the phone to his face, her expression unreadable. She simply nodded. They found Dr. Kim in a dimly lit office that smelled of antiseptic and decay. He was an old man, his shoulders stooped under the weight of a long-held guilt. When Minjun, with Adeola at his side, placed the tiny device on his desk, the old doctor began to weep. "I knew this day would come," he whispered, his voice trembling. Through shuddering sobs, the story poured out. After the car crash that had killed Minjun's parents, the young boy had been brought to him by Park Jinwoo. Minjun had suffered a head injury, but his hearing was intact. Park, however, had other plans. He wanted control of the syndicate, but a direct takeover was impossible. So he devised a more insidious plot. He would raise the heir as a puppet, his power absolute but invisible. He blackmailed Dr. Kim, using his past scandal as leverage, forcing him to perform the experimental procedure. The device was a marvel of bioengineering, a neural dampener designed to sever the connection between the auditory nerve and the brain, perfectly mimicking congenital deafness. It was powered by the body's own bioelectricity. It was undetectable. He wanted a king who could not hear his people's counsel, Dr. Kim confessed, his face buried in his hands. A god who could not hear his own praise. He stole your life, your world, all for power. The doctor's confession settled in the small, quiet room, a truth so monstrous it seemed to suck the very air from it. Minjun felt a cold, clean rage replace the chaotic shock. It was a familiar feeling, this controlled fury, but the target had never been so close, so personal. His entire reality had been a meticulously crafted prison, and the warden had been the man he called uncle. They left the doctor with his ghosts and a small recording device that had captured every word of his confession. They found a new safe house, a small apartment above a bustling market, the sounds and smells of which were a constant, dizzying reminder of the world he was now a part of. The next few days passed in a strange, suspended state. Minjun was a student, and Adeola an accidental teacher. The world of sound was a foreign language, and he was a desperate immigrant. He began the painful process of learning. Adeola would sit with him for hours, her patience seemingly infinite. "That," she would say, pointing out the window, "is a bird. The high, fast sound. The low, rumbling sound is a truck." She taught him the difference between the sharp slam of a door and the gentle click of a lock. She played music for him on her phone, starting with simple, classical melodies. The first time he heard a piano, a single, clear note played by Bach, tears streamed down his face. It was the first purely beautiful thing he had ever heard, a moment of perfect order in the chaos. He learned the sound of rain on a window pane, the sizzle of food in a pan, the soft whisper of cloth against skin. He was learning to be human again, one sensation at a time. The most difficult sound was her voice. It was a low, soothing melody that cut through his anxiety. He found himself listening to the cadence of her speech, the way her tone rose slightly when she was explaining something, the soft, breathy sound she made when she thought he was asleep. He started to speak more, his voice slowly losing its rough and used edge. He would practice saying words, tasting their shape and sound. One evening, as she was showing him how to distinguish the sound of different spices being ground in a mortar, he stopped her. He looked at her, his gaze direct. "Adeola," he said. It was the first time he had spoken her name. The sound of it was strange and wonderful on his own tongue. She froze, the pestle still in her hand. A faint blush colored her cheeks. "Yes, Minjun," she replied softly. In that moment, the space between them shifted. It was not a confession of love, but of recognition. A quiet acknowledgement of the profound, unshakable bond that had been forged in chaos and betrayal. He was no longer a myth, and she was no longer a maid. They were two people, survivors, bound by a stolen secret and the shared intimacy of a world being reborn. The period of healing was not one of passivity. As Minjun's senses recalibrated, so did his mind. The rage remained, a cold, dense star at the center of his being, but it was now focused, channeled. He was no longer just the silent observer. He was a listener. And he began to listen to the city, to the whispers of his own underworld. Using a network of old loyalties and encrypted channels, he reached out. He didn't issue commands, he asked questions. He listened to the fear in the voices of his captains, the uncertainty sown by Park's new regime. Park had moved quickly, declaring Minjun missing, likely dead at the hands of a rival. He was consolidating power, purging those whose loyalty to the Kong name was too strong. But Park had made a critical error. He had ruled for 25 years from the shadows, through a silent puppet. He did not understand the personal bonds Minjun, even in his silence, had forged. He did not understand that the syndicate's loyalty was to the man, the myth, not the position. Minjun listened to recordings of Park's speeches to the other family heads, speeches filled with false grief and crocodile tears. Hearing the voice that had lied to him his entire life filled him with a chilling resolve. The plan for his return began to form. It would not be a covert strike, a sniper's bullet from a distant rooftop. That was Park's way. Minjun's reclamation had to be public. It had to be a performance of truth, a theatrical undoing of a lifetime of lies. The syndicate was built on a foundation of face, honor, and perception. He would use their own codes against the man who had corrupted them. He learned that Park was planning a formal ceremony to install himself as the new, official chairman of the Syndicate Alliance, an event to be attended by the heads of all the major families. It was to be held in the grand ballroom of the Millennium Hotel, a place synonymous with the Syndicate's power. That would be his stage. Adeola watched him during this time, saw the transformation. The wounded, disoriented man was being forged into something new. He moved with his old economy, but now it was paired with a new awareness. He would tilt his head to catch the distant sound of a siren, his eyes closing as he identified and dismissed it. He was a weapon being resharpened, honed on the whetstone of his newfound sense. One evening, he stood before the small mirror in the apartment, looking at his own reflection. "My voice," he said, listening to the sound of it in the small room. "It is not what I expected." Adeola came to stand beside him, her reflection appearing next to his. "What did you expect?" she asked gently. "I did not expect anything," he answered, turning to face her. "I had no concept, but it feels like my own." Finally, he was ready. The myth was dead. The man was about to be reborn. The night of the ceremony, the grand ballroom of the Millennium Hotel was a shimmering sea of black silk suits and restrained power. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne, cigar smoke, and mutual distrust. At the head of the vast, U-shaped table, Park Jin-woo sat like a king on a borrowed throne. He was mid-speech, his voice, amplified by a microphone, a smooth, practiced baritone filled with false solemnity. He spoke of legacy, of the tragic loss of his beloved nephew, of the heavy burden of leadership he was now forced to assume for the good of the families. The doors at the far end of the ballroom were guarded by Park's personal men, stony-faced and armed. The heads of the other families listened, their expressions impassive, each calculating how this shift in power would affect their own fortunes. It was in the middle of a sentence about honoring Minjun's memory that the main door swung open. The guards tensed, but they did not move, because the man who walked in was not a threat they had been trained for. Kang Min-jun entered the ballroom. He wore a simple, perfectly tailored dark suit. He was alone. A collective gasp, a sound he could now hear and appreciate, swept through the room. Men who had built empires on their unflappable composure stared, their mouths agape. Park froze, the microphone clutched in his hand, his face a mask of disbelief that quickly curdled into pure hatred. Min-jun did not rush. He walked the length of the room, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor, a steady, deliberate rhythm. The sound of his own progress was a comfort. He stopped at the foot of the table, his eyes locking with Park's. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy, expectant blanket.
Uncle, Minyon Said.
His voice, unamplified, was clear, calm, and carried to every corner of the room. It was a voice of command. You speak of my memory. I find the topic premature. A tremor of shock went through the assembled men. It wasn't just that Min-jun was alive.
He could speak.
He could hear. The entire foundation of their understanding of the man was shattered in that instant. What is this trickery? Park hissed into the microphone, his voice betraying a sliver of panic. This is not him, isn't it? Min-jun replied, his gaze never leaving Park's. For 32 years I lived in a world you built for me. A silent world. A prison. You made me a symbol, a myth I could not question because I could not hear the lies. He took a small object from his pocket. The recording device. He pressed a button. Dr. Kim's trembling voice filled the ballroom, a ghostly confession from the past, detailing every sordid detail of the conspiracy. As the doctor's story unfolded, Min-jun watched the faces of the family heads. He saw doubt turn to shock, shock to dawning fury. They were criminals, yes, but they had a code. The betrayal of blood, the perversion of loyalty for personal gain, it was a cardinal sin. When the recording finished, Min-jun held up another small object, pinched between his thumb and forefinger. The dark, segmented device. He put this in my head, Min-jun said, his voice dropping, becoming more personal, more dangerous. He stole the world from me. He stole my father's legacy. All to sit in a chair that was never his. He looked away from Park then, addressing the room. The golden dragon has been poisoned from the head. I have returned to purge it. The resolution was not a chaotic firefight. It was a judgment. The moment Min-jun finished speaking, the spell of Park's authority was broken. The family heads, men who respected strength and authenticity above all else, looked from the exposed, panicked traitor to the reborn, commanding heir. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a correction. Two of the oldest patriarchs at the table, men who had known Min-jun's father, slowly rose to their feet. They did not speak. They simply turned their backs on Park Jin-woo. One by one, the other leaders followed suit. It was a silent, damning verdict. Park's face, which had cycled through disbelief and rage, finally settled on a pathetic, pleading terror. He is lying. It's a trick, he stammered into the microphone, but his voice was drowned out by the scraping of chairs. His own guards, seeing the tide turn so irrevocably, hesitated, their loyalty evaporating in the face of the syndicate's collective will. They slowly backed away, leaving him isolated at the head of the table. Min-jun simply watched, his expression cold and impassive. He had passed the sentence. The room would be the executioner. He turned and walked away, back toward the doors. He did not need to see what happened next. He could hear it. The sound of heavy footsteps approaching the head table. The scrape of Park's chair as he tried to flee. A single, sharp cry, quickly silenced. The sounds were ugly, brutal, but they were the sounds of justice in his world. He did not flinch. He walked out of the ballroom and did not look back. The city lights glittered below, a sprawling tapestry of life and noise. For the first time, it did not feel like an assault. It felt like a symphony, and he was finally ready to be its conductor. He found Adeola waiting for him in the lobby, a small, still point in the hotel's swirling chaos. She held his coat. Her face was calm, but her eyes were searching his. He took the coat from her, the fabric soft under his newly sensitive fingertips. They stood for a moment in the echoing silence between them. The world he had reclaimed, the empire he now truly owned, all of it paled in comparison to the simple, profound truth of her presence. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling small, inadequate for the universe she had given him. She looked up at him, a small, genuine smile finally gracing her lips. "You had the world all along, Min-jun," she said, her voice the most beautiful sound he knew. "You just needed to learn how to listen." He reached out, not to take her hand in a gesture of possession, but to gently touch her fingers, a brief, respectful contact. It was a promise, not of romance, but of recognition. She was not a prize to be won. She was the restorer, the catalyst, the quiet woman who had shattered a myth and, in doing so, allowed a man to finally be born. Together, they walked out into the noisy, vibrant, living night.